Number 11, John McRae stayed here. Then Mrs. Skeen with sons Robin and Louis. Robin married Beatrice Craig from Elchies. They had two sons, Ronald and Douglas. Now Bill Ingram stays here. Number 12, Mr. and Mrs. William Nichol, gravedigger, with son Jamesy. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. McGregor. She was Willie's daughter and family. Now it is Bill Ingram's daughter, Terry. James, the father of James the roadman, stayed here. He was known as Cherry Blossom, as he was very tidy and polished his boots every day. Then Mr. and Mrs. Nicholson and family. Then Mr. and Mrs. William Fisher and family, Heather and Billy. Mrs. Fisher was Narth and Grant Stewart's sister, Elma. Then Mr. and Mrs. Milton and family. Then Mr. and Mrs. John Fraser and daughter Elsie and son David. Now William Cratnach, who farmed Tyrcastle. He made the two houses into one. Number 14, Mr. and Mrs. John Mackenzie and family, Jimmy, Minnie, Johnny, Willie and Jessie. Jessie still stays here today, 2 doors along from here. Number 15, this house was built for a policeman. The first one was John Duncan. Number 16, the Mackenzies flitted to here and Jessie still stays here today. Number 17, Nurse Mitchell was the first tenant with her mother. Rose Cottage, Mr. and Mrs. Sandy McLennan. He was a tailor. His shop was at the back of the house. Then Mr. Muirden. Then Mr. and Mrs. Narth Stewart with daughter Elizabeth. Number 19, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Hay and family. Charles, Robin, Dan, Heck, Jean and Babs. Babs married George Stronach, who had 2 lorries and carted wood. Charlie Hay was postman and went to Runnyvay, over the Lenach to the Succoth, to Alta-Uish to the Ardoch on his bicycle every day. Dan and Ethel's son, Hector, stays here now. Number 20, Scott's Buildings as I knew it. Mr. and Mrs. James Stewart and family. Charles, Margaret, Bert, Narth, Elma and Grant. Bert was the last Stewart to stay here, and he was the last local postman to deliver on a bicycle. Narth had a Morris lorry and a float for a time. Mrs. Stewart brought up 3 children, Alec Gow, Mamie Stewart and Alan Kemp. Alan later worked with Narth in the dairy at Schoolbay. On the other end of Scott's Buildings, Mr. and Mrs. James Garland with daughter Elsie May and Jessie Watson stayed here. Then Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Harvey, the estate keeper from the Lenach, retired to here. Number 22. There were 2 single-storey houses here. Jess Geddy and family stayed in the end next Scott's Building, and Jessie Mackenzie's granny in the other end. Mrs. Rothney, daughter Maggie and son David stayed here. It was a pub in the early days, but then closed. Dave was postman for the village and over by Tombreck, Clashdon, Moss End and home back again. He had 2 shilts to work the land, and he went to the Scottish Horse Camp every year at Blairathel with them. They were loaded on the train at Elgin Station. They had 3 cows, calves, 2 pigs. Maggie did milking and sold the milk in the village. Dave had one of the first cars in Dallas. Number 2. My grandmother, Menzies, stayed here with her daughter, Jeannie. Then Mr. and Mrs. daughters, Rita, Annie Dara, and Mrs. Barrow. Alligator Murray's dead. Then Mrs. Colley retired to here. Chester stayed here. Then Mr. and Mrs. William Carlin the Blacksmith, the sons Willie and David, then his son and his sister, Nath and Betty Stewart. Betty still stays here, and is church organist and local Southern Scott reporter. Number 4. Mary Scott stayed here with her Scotty dog. It used to chase her unless we gave it a piece. Then Mr. and Mrs. Garcity built a small shop here with petrol pumps. Well demolished, and this house was built. Number 5. Mrs. Skeen and family. Willie, who went to Canada, Robin, Margaret and Louis stayed here. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Proctor, who took over the postage. And Mr. and Mrs. Alec Duncan to work in Elk. Postmaster, Mr. Menzies, then Mr. Shaw. Number 6. Mr. and Mrs. Alec Cowell of the shop stayed here. He bred Scotty dogs. Then Mr. and Mrs. Ollie Duncan, he was the baker. Then Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Menzies, my cousin. Tippy's father, Richie Harold, boys, and Jock Harold. Then this house was used as the post office, and Mr. Proctor next door became postmaster. Number 7. There was a double-storey house here, just beside the dyke. Mr. and Mrs. William Morrison stayed downstairs, and Mrs. Dick stayed upstairs. Her entry was by a stone staircase at the rear. Number 8. Where this bungalow stands was an L-shaped house behind this, which belonged to Dr. Douglas, the medical officer for health for Murray and Nairn. He was a brother of Alex Sutherland's wife, Lottie, who stayed at the east end of the village. Then there was Stevenson the policeman, with his wife and daughter. Then Mr. and Mrs. Alec Rose and family, Alistair and Lorna. Then Mr. and Mrs. David Mackenzie, better known as Cobb. He sold cars from the black shed which faced onto the back road behind the house. 8A. There was a house here where these two sheds are, next door to the black shed. Mr. and Mrs. James Stewart and family stayed here while Scott's building was being modified. 9. Bean Watt stayed here with her family, Andy, Ella and Betty. Then Mr. and Mrs. Christie, who built the shop. Mrs. Templeton lived upstairs. Her entry was by an outside stone staircase at the rear. Now the whole building is the Dallas Hotel. Number 10. Mrs. Dunbar and family, Joe, Jean and Belle stayed here. Jock Stewart also lodged here. Mrs. Dunbar ran the post office from here. She brought up 4 children, Jack, Helen and Alec Kemp and Pat McKinnon. Jock, who was Louis Stewart of Scott O'Clyse's brother. Jock married Mrs. Dunbar, flitted to Altahorn. Mr. and Mrs. Ollie Duncan took over the post office here. They brought up a girl, Bunty Singer. My father then bought the property when Mr. and Mrs. Duncan moved to Elgin to retire from the shop. It was let to Mr. and Mrs. Bob Smith, then Mr. and Mrs. Bert Sutherland and sons Gordon and Robert, then to Marjorie Robertson. I sold it in 1972 to Alec Thompson of Mormont, son of Ian, who stays here now. Number 11. My parents bought this property in 1929 and turned it into a house and a shop. The steading beam behind was turned into stores. My father had a horse-pulled van and went round the countryside selling the goods. He later was postman when Charlie Hay retired. Dave Rothney